and I'm going to say welcome everybody to this lecture by Rivanna about racism in mental health care, for which decolonial mental health will be the solution. I hope I didn't spoil the whole lecture with this thing. I'm very curious to what you have to say, Rivanna. You did a research on this, so it's your turn.
Thank you so much. Hi, guys. I'm Rivanna. Nice to meet you. I recently graduated in Maastricht University from the study European Public Health. And for my bachelor thesis, I discussed and tried to analyze how race would affect mental health in the Netherlands. In order to do so, I had to interview a couple of therapists, under which Misha, who you guys know, and who introduced me to you guys to give this talk. I interviewed white therapists and Black therapists in the Netherlands to see, okay, what do you guys think? I wanted to interview patients, but because it was a bachelor thesis, the ethics committee made it very, very difficult for me to do so. So because of time and things, I just focused on what actual mental health professionals thought about race within Netherlands. So this talk will be exploring the results of that a little bit, exploring what some of the theory that I found, some of the facts and figures that I found, and possible solutions towards the end, right? With the recent rise of talks around race, like with BLM, with the Zwarte Piet debate, et cetera, things like racism is extremely relevant for today's society. And it can also be kind of uncomfortable, especially if you're white. But I would like to think that temporary discomfort, talking about things that will better everyone's life in the future, temporary discomfort outweighs trying to better people's life in the future in that sense. So the way I decided to kind of set up this talk was to sort of have a discussion, if that's okay. I'm going to ask a couple of questions pretty similar to what I asked the therapist during my thesis. And I'd like to hear you guys' input. I'd like to hear back and forth discussion about what you guys would think about certain topics. So hopefully that's okay with you guys. So just to kind of go over the contents for today, it'll be in 4 parts. First of all, we'll be discussing racism in mental health care in general. Because the research in the Netherlands, which I will come to later, there barely is any research in the Netherlands when it comes to racism in mental health care. I had to look to other countries which were pretty comparable. So I looked at the US, which has a huge amount of research, and the UK, which also had a surprising amount of research about it. Then from racism in mental health care, I will go look at racism in the Netherlands. Why would racism in mental health care be a relevant topic in the Netherlands? And then the third part, racism in Dutch mental health care, sort of combining the first 2 and also discussing the results I had found in my thesis. And then the fourth part, what is our solution? How can we solve this, etc. So firstly, I would like to ask you guys a question, if that's okay. What barriers do you think Black people would face when accessing a mental health care system?
I really don't know. Hi, Rivanna. No, maybe they are scared that they won't be heard or understood. Mm-hmm. That could be a block for them, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or maybe some cultural, ideas around having to go to a doctor or a psychologist.
Yeah, those are 2 very good examples. In this case, I really don't want to say that there's a right or wrong answer. I feel like if you're thinking about things that would hinder other people of accessing the mental health care system, there is no real wrong answer, you know? So those are two very, very good examples. Does anyone else have any ideas?
I don't know if I'm saying it in English right, but maybe the prejudice. So people
prejudice.
think a lot of things when they see people with another skin color, prejudice, like about their culture maybe or otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. So do you think this would be more from the side of the clinician, or would it be more of the side of like the patient towards the clinician?
I'm thinking maybe both sides. Maybe the people think, well, here I'm, you know, thinking that the clinician will have prejudice, or maybe heard stories from other people, how they have been treated maybe, and the clinician maybe also having a little bit of a prejudice about, oh, that's, you know, that kind of person, maybe even putting it in a harsh way like that.
No, it's pretty much exactly, yeah, that's also what I found. Anyone else?
Maybe the way their family members view them going to psychologists, although I think that could be for anyone, not specifically for people of a different skin color.
True, true, true. Anyone else, anything to add? No? Okay, well, then I will go into what I found when asking myself this question. I'll start off with this quote from Suman Fernando. Just as racism is the key, or one of the keys, to understanding how this happened, it may well be that racism is a key to understanding the apparent paradox we see in the mental health scene today. The fact that Black people's negative experience of a supposedly caring medical profession like psychiatry, and the problems that we seem to have in developing culturally sensitive ways of practicing psychological therapies. For me, this pretty much sums up how I started researching mental health care, especially in the Netherlands, because it seems to me, and it seemed to a lot of people, that the experience that white people have was not the same as the experience Black people were having, or the experience white people were having is not the same as the experience people of color were having. So this question of why is this extremely delicate, extremely sensitive area of medicine treated, why are two groups of people treated so differently? So in 2001, the US General Surgeon released a report about mental health, the state of mental health services and facilities within the US. They talked about how mental health was really becoming more of a public health issue, as opposed to an issue that was dealt separately from medicine. This report, released in 2001, also had a supplement that focused purely on culture, race, and ethnicity. This supplement was pretty much my holy grail for my thesis, because it provided so much material of how to view mental health through the lens of culture, race, and ethnicity. Within the supplement, it's maybe like 400 pages long, and they looked at not just African Americans, but they also looked at Asian Americans, looked at Pacific Asians, they looked at Latin Americans, and that's it. And they looked at how exactly culture affected the efficiency of the mental health treatment that they received. When it came to the barriers that impacted a minority's experience, there were a couple that were universal throughout all the races. Firstly, the perception or understanding of people's mental health, of mental illness in general. I think this is pretty much a universal thing as well, where there is a stigma around mental health, right? There's people believe that mental health makes you weak, having mental illness makes you weak, makes you, you get viewed a certain type of way. There's a stigma around it. And in communities where Western psychology is not the norm, these stigmas can be even worse in that sense. The way, in order to, sorry, wait, I lost my train of thought. Let's see. Yes, so because in these communities of color, mental illnesses can create even more social stigma than already exists in that sense. So you have the social stigma that you deal with as being a minority in that society. Then there's the additional stigma of being a mentally ill minority. This is called like double stigma. And I think it was Faye Gary back in 2004 who came up with this concept, that this was a massive barrier for people of color that prevented them from properly accessing and properly utilizing mental health facilities. Besides that, there's also a deep mistrust that African Americans have, or that people of color have, in the healthcare system in general. This mistrust is not really unfounded. You have a system that is based on the colonization of your people, and that profits purely of the colonization of your people, and that prioritizes white bodies over anything else. And this is the same system that is supposed to provide equality towards you. This just, it doesn't add up in most people's minds. There's also has been historically a lot of people who misuse the little trust that people of color have in the healthcare system for their own benefit. In this case, there would be things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where I think under 300 African-American men were infected with syphilis and used basically as an experiment to see, oh, what happens with untreated syphilis treatment. But they were under the impression that they were getting treated for syphilis. Cases like this, things like this that were done and promoted and funded by the US government causes a deep-seated mistrust in the healthcare system. There's also quite a history of misdiagnosis and mistreatment. When it comes to diagnosis in America, it is like a double-edged sword, basically. Mental illnesses that are seen as like too emotional or too emotional, such as like depression or anxiety, they were severely underdiagnosed in African Americans, especially African American women. But mental illnesses that are associated with stereotypes like aggression, violence, such as schizophrenia or psychotic illnesses, they were overrepresented in African Americans, especially African American males. When it comes to the treatment of these illnesses, it's the same. The people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia tend to be over medicated as well for the treatment. And the people who were diagnosed with depression, if they were ever diagnosed with depression, tended to be even under medicated. This was found by, I'm pretty sure you guys heard of the study. This was Whaley back in the 1990s, who discovered this clinician's bias that happens, especially amongst African-American men, when it came to the diagnosis of psychotic or psychotic illnesses or schizophrenia. This is not just isolated to America. If you look at the UK, there's also been a history of Black British men who, when they are sent to prison, or when they are when they receive the, how would you say it, like a sentencing that involves a certain amount of aggression, a certain amount of violence, they only tend to get diagnosed with schizophrenia after the fact, and in a criminal setting as opposed to in a clinical setting, if that makes sense. This is a quote from Matt Meyer. He was the chief executive of the Sainsbury's Centre of Mental Health in the UK. And I think this quote really summarized for me what one of the biggest problems that the UK had when it came to racism in mental health care. African and Caribbean people are often terrified of seeking help for mental health problems. They fear being locked up, over-medicated, and in extreme cases, dying in hospital. That those fears are frequently justified is a fact that demands immediate attention. One of those justified facts is David Bennett. That's the person you see over here. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was unjustly restrained and died in the process. People found out that during the inquiry, people found out that this wasn't an isolated case, that this was often the case when it came to British Black men. They were over-medicated. They were treated a lot more extremely than they should have been treated, and often case with a fatal result. What David Bennett's death did then for British policy was that it introduced a new sort of approach towards mental health, for especially with keeping race in mind. There is the Delivering Race Equality framework, which they set up, which was really a program designed to educate, designed to re-educate the people who are already existent within the mental health care system, and to sort of reevaluate when higher dosages were required, reevaluate when harsher measures were required to restrain a patient, et cetera, et cetera. And there have been some significant results since this was first implemented. So yeah, then that's a pretty quick summary of what I'd found in regards to some of the barriers and some of the problems that Black people faced and people of color faced when when accessing the mental health care system. Now we'll go on to part 2 with the very interesting question: does the Netherlands have a racism problem? Do you guys think the Netherlands has a racism problem? Yes. In what sense? Like, why? I know when I've asked other people this, there was a bit of hesitation because they weren't sure if it did, and they often jump to comparing it to the US, because the US has very physical symptoms of a racism problem, in that, like, police brutality, et cetera, but you don't really see that in the Netherlands, or at least they don't want us to see that as much in the Netherlands. So how does the Netherlands have a racism problem?
Yeah, sorry. I don't know exactly how. I just know that it is there. You can see it from the discussion over our children's party, Sinterklaas and Zwarte Piet, for instance. You know, people are going at each other, and then you see what lives beneath the surface, so to speak. So I certainly believe that there is a racism problem in the Netherlands, just based off such examples.
Yeah, exactly. It's there are a lot of symptoms that I think people don't really think about as deeply as they would in the US.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I guess also with jobs, right? Like, if you apply for a job that some like white people get a preference, or like that if they see names like Moroccan name, Turkish name, that they prefer the Dutch one, or like not even consciously maybe, but like also unconsciously, I guess.
Yeah. I think this is just a random story, but just to emphasize your point, I once applied for a job during when I was a student. I once applied for a job at like a fry shop, right? I speak Dutch. I've been in the Netherlands for like, I think 13 years total. And when I went for the interview, the guy sat me down and he said, you know, we don't usually hire Black people, but I was having this discussion with my wife yesterday and I thought, you know, let's try something different, you know, let's try hiring a Black person for once. And I remember sitting there thinking, that's a pretty big red flag right there. I ended up not getting the job. I wonder why. But yeah, no, it definitely does play a role in the job market. So yeah, when it comes to, this is the introduction of Gloria Vecker's book, White Innocence, which is a book I really recommend. And she says, this book is dedicated to an exploration of a strong paradox that is operative in the Netherlands, and that, as I argue, is at the heart of the nation. The passion, forcefulness, and even aggression that race elicits among the white population, while at the same time the reactions of denial, disavowal, and elusiveness reign supreme. What this sort of implies is the kind of unique way in which the Netherlands handles race, right? So if we look at the last 20 years, there's been a sort of shift in people's perception of the Netherlands. If we look at the way people perceive the Netherlands after they legalized gay marriage, after they decriminalized marijuana, even more recently, in light of the BLM protests that happened in like Amsterdam, The Hague, etc., or even like people like Sylvana Simons being elected into government and stuff, it really all serves to add this image of tolerance, this image of liberalism, this image of progressiveness within the Netherlands, right? But when we look at the reality of the situation, the Netherlands still remains a colonial power. It still has a very strong and very bloody colonial history. If the concept of whiteness in general is rooted in racism, there is no white without Black. There is no, like, white is considered the default, and then everything else, Black, Asian, etc., is considered the other, is considered different. The Netherlands has this concept, and therefore the Netherlands still has racism. When the special rapporteur from the UN came to the Netherlands back in 2019 even, they went back to the UN and created a report. And within that report, they said that there was a concerning increase of nationalism within the Netherlands, with the focus of being Dutch, being equal to being white and being of Western origin. In addition to this, they also said that there was a complete lack of intervention from the government. The government wasn't really doing anything to combat this. If anything, there were certain members of the government that were sort of using this increase of nationalism to increase their own power within the government. And yet, despite all this, we still don't really discuss race. We still don't really talk about race. There is a beautiful quote from Philomena Essed, where she says that there is almost a sort of smugness about the way the Netherlands talks about race, that racism, as if racism has no relevance in the 21st century, when we know now it has more relevance than ever. Let's see. Another example that I found, this is also from Gloria Vecker's book. This was an excerpt from her book, White Innocence, where she describes having watched a very popular TV show, De Wereld Draait Door. And the journalist, who is a white male journalist, Martin Brill, he talks about his two daughters expressing his expectation that one of these days, the oldest one will bring a boyfriend home. To loud laughter and acclaim, he voices his biggest concern. Suppose she brings a big Negro home. This kind of statement, of course, in today might have gotten Brill canceled. But even in 2008, which wasn't as long ago as we think, this wasn't discussed. This was just readily accepted. There was no, as she said, there was no sign from the audience or from the other host that there was any inappropriateness in this. I think if you talk to any person of color, especially when in the Netherlands, you'll have this sort of reaction, right? Where someone could say something exceptionally racist and the other person will say, okay, but it was a joke, or, but I can't be racist, I have this, or, oh, this is, it's, you know, it's not as serious as you think it is, etc. I bring this up not necessarily because of like the, you know, he said, she said kind of rhetoric, but more of the fact that this is really a perfect example of how the Netherlands describes, deals with racism. Someone says something extremely racist, people don't really react, people don't hold them accountable. In fact, people would go out of their way to say it didn't happen. So yeah, verbal discrimination isn't the key. It isn't the main problem. It is a symptom of the problem. This really showcases the Dutch tolerance that is so famous. This showcases it in sort of everyday scenarios that people are used to. We have proclamations from like people like Geert Wilders, and his quite famous Minder Marokkanen speech to quite recent outbursts from Baudet, who said that AIDS is not a problem for white heterosexual men. Statements like these don't seem to be tackled at the root, don't seem to be tackled at the source of the problem. They seem to be handled in a way of like, oh, they shouldn't really be saying that, but these are still two prominent men in government, right? So the response to these statements are more telling than the statement themselves. So then the answer to the question, is Netherlands racist? Yes. Yeah, it's pretty racist. So as racism is a systematic problem, as racism is something that's just deeply, deeply rooted in Dutch society, how does this lack of discussion affect on other sectors in Dutch society? How would it affect the mental health care system? And also, given the lack of research that has been done around it, can we say that the factors that the barriers that we saw before in the US and the UK, would they be the same in the Netherlands? Which leads us then to, part 3. What factors might affect a person's experience of the Dutch mental health care system? When I discussed this in my thesis, I had very little to go with. I had the data I gathered from the therapists I interviewed, and I had maybe a total of 3 or 4 papers that talked about different, they didn't talk about Black people specifically. They talked about, for example, there was one that talked quite clearly about Chinese people, or Moroccans, people from Muslim background. So those were the ones I sort of used alongside the research that I found from the UK and the US. Right, so firstly, stigma, that was one that was mentioned before. according to the Black mental health care professionals I interviewed, because of the sort of differences in communities between like the white community and a Black community, within the Black community, your mental health is not really seen as your own. It reflects on your family and it reflects on the community as well. The pressure that a Black person's environment that can reinforce their own associations with mental health, and then act as a preventative measure against seeking out the mental health care in the first place. And then secondly, the education of the physician. So every therapist I interviewed, I asked them where they studied, if they felt that their study was inclusive, if they felt their study was heavily Western, if they felt that their study could have been more inclusive, etc. And in most cases, I think it was noted that the education that they got did not reflect the diversity of their clientele. Oftentimes, if they would get someone from a different culture, they would end up Googling about the person's culture, Googling, oh, how might this person handle this kind of, or what's the norm in this culture to handle this kind of mental illness, etc. And while in recent times, because the person I think that graduated most recently was in 2019, and they expressed that there was a larger focus on the education being Western. There was an emphasis on that. They said, okay, this is Western psychology. This can only really apply to people from a Western background, etc. But that still didn't give them the tools to deal with non-Western people. It only gave them the foresight to say, okay, because I have a Western-based knowledge, this is what I'll have to do if I am dealing with someone different. Then thirdly, this is quite an interesting point. There was a sort of a divide between people when it came to the discussion discussion of race within therapy. So when it came to the Black psychologists, it just seemed like it's the most obvious thing. Race and racism can play a huge role in someone's mental health. And so the discussion of it seems almost obvious. Whereas when some of the white therapists that I talked to, there was a sort of, they explained that they were hesitant to do so because they felt that they didn't have the tools, they weren't equipped to handle such a conversation, and they might in turn make their client uncomfortable, make their patient uncomfortable. Then there was a question of bias. So as I mentioned before, clinicians' bias was a pretty big barrier for people in other countries. And when asked about it, the therapists that I interviewed also agreed, but there was a difference in severity. So when I talked to the white therapists, they mostly explained like, yes, there can be bias, but we are trained to combat that. There's bias in every situation, you know? Whereas when it came to the Black psychologists, they seemed to understand that there was a sort of deeper rooted bias that could exist that people might not necessarily be trained for. So that was also quite an interesting result. And then there was also a question of representation. Of course, within the Netherlands, there isn't a huge amount of Black people within that give therapy, or Black people that have successfully gone through therapy, or that are sort of given the platform to talk about that. So this sort of gives the illusion then that therapy or the mental health service in general is just not for Black people. Then lastly, racism. The Black therapists, when asked about this, every single one of them burst out laughing. When I asked, oh, is there racism in mental health care? They burst out laughing because they some of them were just really frustrated with the fact that there is racism in mental health care and it really shouldn't be because they just want to help people. And some of them thought it was just a very silly question for me to ask. On the other hand, with the white therapist, there was some hesitation. There was some like, oh yeah, no, I could see why there could be, you know, if there's bias, that could lead to some acts of racism, but they couldn't really see why that would be like the norm, or why that would be like, that they thought it would be an exception to the case, which is also a very interesting difference between the two groups. Let's see. So then what the other things I found within my thesis was that obviously the GGZ was reformed to be accessible and available. And despite this, there is very little research done on the negative impact that race or ethnicity can have on a person's experience with the Dutch mental health care system. But race is a very important component to consider when looking at inconsistencies within healthcare. If you want mental health care to be equitable for everyone, but Dutch policies and frameworks don't seem to reflect this. When in other countries, when it became a public spectacle, active change was made. But in the Netherlands, it seems like it is not even anywhere in anyone's periphery to even discuss. So then we come to our last part. And then I have another question for you guys. How would you combat bias within your own therapy sessions?
I think to start is to be aware that you have bias, or if you have bias.
Yeah, exactly. And that's already a pretty big step, I think. Ruud, what did you want to say?
Well, I'm thinking maybe also asking your client questions about, you know, if I'm aware of my biases or aware of my lack of knowledge of somebody's culture, maybe that gives me the space to, you know, ask questions like, how does that sit with you? Or is there something, you know, maybe from your culture, but yeah, I'm not a lot further than that in my thinking about this. I'm very curious to your answer to this question.
No, that's one of the answers actually, to just keep in touch with your patient in regards to biases you may have or assumptions you may have. I know in my own experience, this was a very helpful thing to have someone just check in once in a while, being like, oh, am I making an assumption about this because you're Black, because you're from Nigeria, or is this the reality of your situation? It helped me not feel pigeonholed in that sense. Does anyone else have any sort of idea of how you would combat this kind of scenario in your own sessions?
I would strongly agree with Ruud. This is something that I always do with patients from all different backgrounds, different cultures. You know, you can't be educated in all of them, right? So it's just talking to people, being curious. You know, just tell me about it, and I'll try to think of a way to help you in your, you know, in your world representation, so to speak. Yeah. So I try to tune into the patient before me, but it's regardless of their race. So, you know, it's just being curious about their worldview and how I can contribute to that.
No, exactly. Yeah. I will elaborate definitely on what you said further in the presentation. Does anyone else have any other ideas? Okay, so then we'll continue. Within the diversity of different cultural understandings of mental health and illness, maybe exists a knowledge that we cannot afford to lose. We erase this diversity at our own peril. So this is from Ethan Waters' book, Crazy Like Us, which I will also talk about more later because it was also a pretty big reason why I wrote this thesis on this topic. Obviously, we cannot solve racism overnight. It is not a very easy solution. If we look at even something as complex as the mental health care system in the Netherlands, we cannot wake up tomorrow and solve all the problems, all the flaws that it has, nor can we wake up tomorrow and solve the racist problems that it might have. This requires, it requires simultaneous and coordinated tackles on like multiple fronts, on like a policy level, on an education level, on an individual level, but also on just a societal level, you know? But luckily, there is already a movement in place that can help us towards tackling these situations, even tackling these situations on multiple fronts. And it's called decolonialism. So many Western countries have a really strong colonial history, which is deeply embedded in their system, causing the system then in turn to be racist. Decolonialization involves unpacking and dismantling these Western colonial structures using two primary elements, Eurocentrism and epistemic violence. I would say actually it uses Eurocentrism as a key element and epistemic violence is a part of that. So first, if we look into Eurocentrism, Eurocentrism is the act of viewing the world through the perspective or through the lens of Western knowledge, seeing Western knowledge as the one only truth, as the correct way of looking at things. When it comes to decolonialization, the decentering of Western concepts is essential, especially the Western concepts that we assume is universally applicable. If we look at the Netherlands, in order to get mental health care, insured mental health care, you need a diagnosis from the DSM-5. You know this. I don't know why I'm explaining it to you, but anyway, you need a diagnosis, right? So the DSM-5 was supposed to be adapted to have a greater cultural sensitivity, right? It was, when reading through it, you can see there are subsections which specifically address some cultural symptoms that people might have and some cultural approaches that you might have towards diagnosis. However, since the release of the DSM-5, there has been some debate about if it actually is as culturally sensitive as it claims to be. There's this really excellent paper by Bredstrom from 2017, which showed that it really didn't treat culture, the DSM-5 didn't really treat culture with the nuance and complexity it treated Western culture. If we look at an example here, so we see that panic disorder, there's a list of symptoms there. And then you can see there's a list of cultural specific symptoms. And at the bottom, there's a very important line, which is such symptoms should not count as one of the 4 required symptoms. So if someone from a different culture experienced all 4 of these culturally specific symptoms, they could not be diagnosed with panic disorder, even though it is still seen as a symptom of panic disorder for a different culture. This did not make sense to me when I first read it. It still does not make sense to me now. And there's also a certain way it's phrased, which is very, very important. As you can see, there is no mention of, there's no mention of like a differentiation between like a Western specific symptoms and a culture specific symptoms. There is the normal symptoms and then the different symptoms, which, as I mentioned before, is what is how you have like a ethnocentric, Eurocentric point of view, accepting Western things as the norm, and then anything different as the other, and as things that shouldn't be taken as the norm in that sense. Then, if we further look into this idea of decentering Western knowledge, we have this idea of epistemic violence. Epistemic violence is violence exerted through knowledge. So it is the active stifling, active erasure of traditional and indigenous knowledge by framing it and by explaining it as primitive and as wrong. Saying, okay, because this knowledge came from Kenya as opposed to Germany, the knowledge from Kenya must be primitive because Germany is Western and Western is good in that sense. Epistemic violence centers Western knowledge as progressive and as correct, as modern. And decolonization involves, epistemic violence centers Western knowledge as the known standard, as the norm, as I showed you in the last example. And then decolonization involves redefining the standard. It involves showing us, saying that the norm isn't necessarily Western. It isn't the only way to look at something. Another example I have for epistemic violence is the weird people theory. Have you guys heard of it? No? Okay. It's one of my favorite things. I loved reading the paper about it. I would highly recommend it. Joseph Henrich and his colleagues did a critical review of population samples of, I think it was like over 700 or something, behavioral psychology research, like the sample used in the studies for behavioral psychology research. And when looking at them, they found that the majority of them fit into this category that they labeled weird. So Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. On top of that, they implied that this was also an extremely specific population to base the majority of behavioral psychology on, and that this really should not be treated as the standard in that sense. Yes, so in this example, you can see that they've taken what we accepted as the norm, which is the weird, if you will, and flipped it to show us that this is not representative of the nuance and the complexity of humans on the planet, of like the human condition. So keeping all of this in mind, what can we do? What can we do to apply this into everyday practice? Like I said before, it's easier said than done. To start off with, I would like to share yet another quote. This is from Abdel Malik Said from 2004, from his book, The Suffering of the Immigrant. Every migrant carries this repressed relation of power between states within himself or herself, and unwittingly recapitulates and reenacts it in her personal strategies and experiences. Thus, the most fleeting encounter between an Algerian worker and his French boss in Lyon, or a Surinamese-born child and a school teacher in Rotterdam, a Jamaican mother and her social worker in London, an Ethiopian elderly and his landlord in Naples, is fraught between the whole baggage of past intercourse between the imperial metropole and its erstwhile colony. What does this say? When it comes to the dynamic between people of color and white people, there is a massive power imbalance already. When it comes to a therapist and their patient, there is also a power imbalance. Obviously, this power imbalance, you try to manage it as best you can. You also use it for good, in a sense, as a push them in, or to guide them rather, towards better mental health. But one thing you have to realize is that when you are sitting opposite a patient of color, that power imbalance is a lot bigger than you are trained to handle. So firstly, I would say address the power imbalance within the therapy treatment. As you said, check in with the patient. Make sure, as you would with the patient, if you notice that they were triggered by something you said, check in if they're triggered by your whiteness. Check in if that's something that makes them uncomfortable. Figure out why it makes them uncomfortable. That sort of line of thinking would help in reducing sort of the power imbalance within therapy. Secondly, the topic of race shouldn't be taboo. You would discuss any other sort of trauma, racism can be a trauma for someone. It shouldn't be something you should be afraid of addressing. If you're afraid you don't know how to address it, there are resources I will come to later that will help you, give you some tools. And also, I would say don't be afraid to check in with the person if you are discussing the topic in the correct way. I added, in a way that it is my reality, it should be yours. Racism really shouldn't be something that we should be afraid of speaking about. It shouldn't be something that makes you uncomfortable. It is the reality of our situation. Then, very simple, easy thing to do, re-examine everything you know. We have bias within ourselves. It's not something we can really do anything about. We have biases. The way we deal with those biases is by re-examining them and re-educating ourselves. That's how we reduce the bias within ourselves. So really, if you find yourself making some assumptions, if you find yourself jumping to a conclusion, if you say, okay, but this is correct, and anything that's not this is upsetting me, try to find out why. Try to look back and think, okay, but is this because this is what I know as a white person? Is this what I am comfortable with from a Western perspective? This is pretty much decolonization. It is just sitting down and re-examining, okay, why is this considered normal? Why is this considered strange? Why is this the way we handle this topic, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see. See and examine how mental health is viewed and treated in other cultures. I'm going to discuss a book later that will really help with this. There is no one standard way of viewing mental health. There is no standard way of viewing just even medicine in general. And so examining other cultures and looking at other perspectives of this will only benefit you in widening your view of this topic. You know, it will only be more beneficial for you in the long run. So look at how mental health is viewed by other people. Look at how mental health might be viewed in Islam, by the Black community, etc., and see how you can incorporate this knowledge into your own practice. See if it's helpful for your own practice. One thing I will always say, make a Black friend, engage with people of color, engage with people from different religions, from different backgrounds. Try not to keep your circle of people that are just similar to you and familiar to you, because that will only narrow your worldview to what you know. There are also a lot of people out there, some of the people I interviewed are working really, really hard to try and widen the Dutch mental health perspective in that sense, to also include Black people. So I don't know, I would try to connect with them and engage with them and listen to what they have to say. There are a lot of platforms and resources. I'll link some of them later, but there are things out there available to you for you to learn. I know these things already. I'm good, but when it comes to, especially when it comes to like white people in these positions of power, you could use this position of power to further educate and to further expand on what you already know. So use the platforms that are out there, use the resources that are available to you. I would say another thing that needs to be done that would help is if you hold people accountable. If you notice there are people around you who are having a bit of a backwards approach to a patient of color, you can't sit by silently. That only perpetuates the harm that is being done, that only makes it worse. You'll have to engage, you have to hold them accountable to a certain extent. I would also say discussion groups about this kind of thing, it can be extremely helpful. So discussion groups that are geared specifically towards treatment of patients of color, etc. These are all, again, these are all suggestions. I know sometimes it's not realistic to entirely gear your entire life towards this, you know, but it does help in the sense of, yeah, it does help the people who really, really need it. So yeah. Then these are the books that carried me through my thesis that I ended up hating because I read them so many, I had to read them so many times at the end, but also that really inspired me to do this thesis in the first place. And that, yeah, you've read quotes throughout this entire presentation of anyway, but I just wanted to take you through them. Firstly, Crazy Like Us by Ethan Waters. This, I think, if you really want to understand, or if you really want to look at how someone goes through the journey of decentering the Western gaze from a white male perspective, this is the ideal book. It's beautifully written, and it really looks at mental health in different countries as well. So we go to Hong Kong, we go to Sri Lanka, Tanzania, and Japan, and it looks at how Western concepts of certain mental illnesses actively harm those people, even in those countries, right? So I think the one from Sri Lanka is probably probably the most interesting one to me. After the tsunami in 2004, 2009, after the tsunami, you know the tsunami I'm talking about in Sri Lanka, there was this wave of counselors and mental health professionals who went to Sri Lanka because they predicted that the country would be massively traumatized, would have this huge wave of PTSD, and they had to get in there before it became detrimental to the country. When they got there, they took, a lot of them didn't speak the language, a lot of them had no experience with Sri Lankan culture, and so a lot of them didn't really know how PTSD would manifest, and were looking for the symptoms that would appear in white Western people who have PTSD. And so they went to Sri Lanka and they found that a lot of people were not experiencing PTSD in the way they were used to. And so they were unequipped to treat them in the way that they wanted to, in that sense. So that really inspired me in that sense, just the idea of wanting to help, coming from a good place, having the best intention possible, volunteering in a country where you don't know anyone, you don't speak the language, but still reinforcing your idea of what mental health or a particular mental illness is onto someone else. That's still somehow oppressive in that sense. So really there's so much at play here. So yeah, I'd really recommend this book. Secondly, The Suffering of the Immigrant. This really is quite an emotional book and a beautiful read for if you want to understand more about the perspective from an immigrant, from someone who's an asylum seeker, from the very start of their journey, from the country they have to leave to them settling into the place, having children there, having generations of children in a Western country. It really takes into like a lot of the complexities of being an immigrant and of being descending from immigrants, and how being in a Western society shapes that. So this is also a book I would highly recommend. White Innocence by Gloria Wekker. If you are interested in how, especially in the Netherlands, how race is expressed and how we, like I said, how we sort of navigate it by ignoring it a little bit, by saying, oh, it's not real, etc. Gloria Wekker's book breaks that down gloriously, and it really brutally at some points, and it really emphasizes the point that there is no such thing as white innocence. Everyone is complicit, and everyone continues to be complicit until we make that change. Another book in support of this one, I would say, is Everyday Racism by Philomena Assed. This is an anthropology, so this is about interviews she did with 55 Black women, half of them from the Netherlands and half of them from the US. And she compared how the Netherlands, how racism in the Netherlands works as compared to like old colonial powers like the US. So this is also quite an interesting one. Let's see, here are some resources I also found. I can send this PowerPoint to anyone who would like to have it, just in case. The one I would like to draw your attention to the most, though, is the very last one, which is just a YouTube series dedicated to talking about decolonization of mental health step by step from several experts in the US. So yeah, in conclusion, it is within your power to make mental health more accessible to minorities and more accessible to Black people. While we lack a lot of research in the Netherlands, while we lack a lot of policy changes and frameworks, etc., it is within your power, and it starts with you, essentially. So I would say be active in it, keep listening, keep engaging in this kind of content and engaging in this kind of discussions. And at the end, if we want this tolerant, progressive, inclusive ideas of the Netherlands to be true, the change starts with all of us. And that's it. Does anyone have any questions? No one have any points, any feedback, anything you might want to add, or anything they want to discuss, or?
Well, I would want to start with complimenting you, because I think you can put attention to a very sensitive subject and something that you are clearly passionate about without judging in a way or blaming or anything like that, but just setting it up like you found it in your research and how it is, and that for me invites thinking about it instead of defending or something like that. So I want to thank you for that and also compliment you.
Thank you.
I don't have a question myself. I think I have a lot of things to think about and books to order. I see that Kaima also unmuted, so I'm going to give you the spotlight.
Yeah, thank you, Ruud. And thank you, Rivanna. It's really interesting, and congratulations on your thesis.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for naming my aunt, of course.
Oh, that's your aunt?
It's my aunt.
Oh my God, yes it is. Oh my God. I'm a huge fan of her work. That's so crazy.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, no, but congratulations. Very interesting and amazing work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I added like the references, but it's literally just everything from my thesis. Again, I will send you the presentation if you are interested in all of that. It's a lot of interesting reading, so that's for sure.
I will put it on our network where I also announce your lecture, so people can look there. Maybe I can make a list of the books that you mentioned, so people can quickly order them.
Nice. Thanks a lot, and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, if we don't have other questions. Oh, Anouk, I see you.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Yeah, it was really nice. Really interesting.
How pretty was my presentation? Can we just appreciate, right?
I loved it. Loved it.
Very pretty.
I put so much effort into it. Thank you.
That was obvious, Rivanna.
Thank you.
Nice one. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Rivanna, and very big compliment on your work. Very well done.
Thank you so much. Thank you.